So, guten Morgen alle zusammen. Good morning. Mein Name ist Christiane Walle-Schneller. Ich arbeite jetzt mit Rosita. Steh mal auf, bitte. Rosita Dienst-Demuth war Lehrerin in Freiburg und hat die ersten Kontakte mit Ronia Beecher hergestellt. Wir arbeiten jetzt 25 Jahre im Blauen Haus. Wir feiern nur 20 Jahre Blaues Haus, weil es vor 20 Jahren renoviert war. So I'm switching to English. We try to speak slowly so that you understand. Am I loud enough? I want to introduce our guests this morning. These are 28 students from the gymnasium, which is about 150 steps from here. In the gymnasium there are other students now busy with guests. We have 40 visitors from 4 different countries, and a few are here in the audience, and 2 are on stage, I would say. So I want to introduce them. This is Ronia Beecher. Ronia Beecher, as a little girl, was called Ronia Reutlinger, and she was born in Lörrach. And as a tiny little girl, age 4, she was taken from Freiburg, where she lived with her parents, to Pont-de-Gurs in Südfrankreich, southern France. And the other guest is someone whose father was born in Breisach. Ronia's grandfather was born in Breisach with the name of Geismar, and Henry's father was born in Breisach with the name of Levi. So Henry, we're turning to Ronia very soon because she will speak to you first. Henry's 92nd birthday was last Sunday, so I think we should all congratulate him after. And I'll come to you later because Henry has already been guest in Breisach with the Blue House 20 years ago and 23 years ago. He was a bit younger then. Okay, I want to welcome Valeska, my partner in the Blue House, who did the preparations for the program that's going on, not only here. I want to welcome a couple of guests, and they will come in with their own questions later. Your questions first, but then Ronia's 2 daughters, Andrea, would you get up and say hello to the students? Andrea Beecher and Judy Beecher. And Judy Beecher we can recognize easily because she usually has a camera in her hand. Then there's Dr. Carol Bodenheimer. She's here with the Blue House. Get up so they can see you. Thank you very much. She's coming in from Texas in the United States. Ronia and her daughter's coming in from New York State in the United States. Then Henry's coming in from London and accompanied by his daughter Karen Borley, and another guest from Lyon in France, François Blum. Welcome to all of you. And there's another guest in the last row, right? Diane, would you get up? Diane Weil, whose father grew up at the Gutgesellentorplatz, which the students all know. Okay. Ronia and her daughters visited Breisach and the Blue House 6 years ago, researching bits and pieces of the family history, and since she was 4 years old, what she experienced then is very difficult to grasp in the memory of someone who, may I say how old you are? Or they can count.
They can count. I'll tell them when I was born.
So you were a teacher also, right?
I'm a teacher.
You're a teacher? Okay. But the lifetime right now, with all the research they do alone together as a group, that's rather recent. It has not been part of your life for decades, so it's fresh.
No,
So,
I don't tell.
okay, you start. We are very, very grateful that you came in from New York and that you're here with us today.
No, my pleasure. So, I'm getting flying. Yeah, I'm good. So the story that I'm going to tell you is we had deep roots here in Baden. As Christiana said, I was born in Lörrach, my grandfather in Breisach, my grandmother also in Lörrach, my mother and her siblings was born in Offenburg. So our roots were very deep in this area. But then came the Hitler era, where we were deported and ultimately, can you understand me in English? Am I speaking slow enough? I hope.
I think it's very good.
So we ultimately came to the United States. When we got there, we never talked about it again. I was 10 years old, and my parents told all of my relatives, don't ask her any questions, just let her live now, let her live in the present, let her have a happy future, and don't ask her any questions anymore. And they didn't. And so my parents and I never talked about it. But luckily, just before my mother passed away, just before my father passed away, one of my daughters, since we knew nothing, asked him to make a tape recording, which we don't do anymore now, a little tape cassette to record our history since we knew so little. So the story that you're going to hear about my parents comes from his little tape recording, and the story that you hear about me comes from my remembrance of what I went through, just so that you know. Because as a 4.5-year-old, you know, your memory, you don't really remember. I mean, when you look back in your own lives, you know, what was your life like at 4.5? And so it was from the time really that I was 4.5 till the time that I was 10 that I'm going to be telling you about. So I was born, and now you know my age, 1936, 3 years after Hitler came into power. And my Aunt Hetty, who lived to be 107, said when she was a young woman, she never experienced any anti-Semitism in her classroom. She had Christian friends, she had Jewish friends, and her life was comfortable. But when Hitler came into power with his extreme hatred for Jews, everything changed. So I'm just going to give you a few of the things that made the change so drastic. So my mother was a dressmaker, my father was a cantor in the synagogue. And they were married in 1935. The Nuremberg laws. How many of you have heard anything about the Nuremberg laws? No, one person. Okay, so if you want to know more about, I don't have very much time to talk. If you want to know more about the Nuremberg laws, look them up on the computer. There were 29 of them, and they completely changed the life of the Jewish people living here. They lost their citizenship. The children were thrown out of school. I used to know them all. You could not have intermarriages. being Jewish was no longer a belief, a thought, a religion. Jews became a race, and a race that you would not want to go near and you do not want to have in your school, on your park benches, any place. And after the Nuremberg laws, many of my mother's brothers and sisters said Germany is no longer a place for us, and they decided that they wanted to leave. And at that time, they still could leave. But then came another terrible thing, which was Kristallnacht. How many of you have heard of Kristallnacht? A few more, where they were rioting, smashing Jewish store windows, overturning graves in cemeteries. There's a word in English, it's called harassing. I don't think you know that word. Do you know what harassing Jewish people? So after that, life changed so much for them. The next day after Kristallnacht, there was a loud knock on our door. There were 2 Gestapos standing there and said my father was arrested. They not only arrested my father, but they arrested every single Jewish man in this whole Baden area. And they brought them to the Dachau concentration camp. And when my father asked, well, why am I being arrested? They said, because the townspeople blame you for all of these riots and we're protecting you. So that's why we're arresting you and we're taking you. So they were taken to this camp called Dachau, which was a concentration camp, and they did all kinds of things to them. My father, I'm not going to go into because I don't have much time, but my father says what we experienced in that camp was unbelievable. You came from your comfortable life and they shaved their heads, there was not enough food, they were beaten, they were made to labor, heavy labor. And he was released 2 months later, but he was told, never, if you tell anybody what happened in this camp, not just my father, but every man, you will be rearrested and you will be sent back. So that was Dachau. When he came back, the synagogue in Freiburg had been destroyed, and he was transferred to Freiburg, where he was now a teacher for all of the Jewish children in this entire Baden area who had been thrown out of the public schools. They could no longer attend public schools, but they did say you can have 2 rooms in one of the schools and have your school there. They had to take the trains and the buses, come from far away because it was the only way they could get an education. Then later, they even couldn't use those schools anymore. They couldn't have recess with the children. They couldn't use the same doors. They had to be totally separated from the German children. Then they went to a community school next to the burnt out synagogue, is what my father said on his tape. Then something else terrible happened. On October 22nd, 1940, again, there was a knock on our door. And again, 2 Gestapo Nazi officers were standing there and saying, you have 1 hour to pack your things, take 1 suitcase each, leave anything of value at home, 100 Reichsmark you can take with you. If you take anything of value, it will be taken away from you. And decide what you're going to take. That's most important. So if you somebody came knocking on your door and said, you need to take one suitcase, you don't know if where are you going? Are you ever going to come back? You don't know. What do you take? So everybody took, it was November, so they took something warm and whatever they thought, maybe some extra shoes or a sweater or a coat. I mean, you know, it was a hard decision to make in 1 hour. So that, it was not, the knock came not only on our door, but it came on 6,500 other Jewish families. They were all taken to the train station from all the different areas in Freiburg. 7 trains were waiting to take them. I don't know. They didn't know where. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know if they were ever going to see their homes again. And they were confused. They were saddened. They just didn't know what was happening to them. So they came. So where did they send them? They sent them to a huge camp in Gers, which is France. Now, you're wondering, why did they send them to France? Because the French at that time had made a deal with Hitler. Hitler had come into the northern part of France, and they said, if you don't come into the rest of France, we'll do whatever you want, Hitler. So it was the French that ran that camp. It was the French military ran the camp. There was Stachelrad, barbed wire all around, and the men and the women were separated. The children could stay with their parents, the boys, till they were 14 years old, and then they had to go with their fathers. The girls could stay with their mothers in the barracks. So they came into the camp. The barracks were totally empty. There was nothing on the floor. No beds, one little stove in the middle, and they were given straw. And they had to put the straw out. They had to put the straw out on all over the floor. A little later on, they were given potato sacks. Like a few weeks later, they could put the straw in the potato sacks. My father says he remembers there were lots of bugs in the straw, lots of fleas, lots of lice, rats. If you need a translation sometimes, she can translate if you don't understand what I'm saying. Could you raise your hand? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So the bathrooms were holes and with a garbage pail underneath it. That was the bathrooms in Gers. There was the one thing that I remember personally is the mud. It was the rainy season, and the water came down like buckets. There were buckets of water. The ground was a swamp. And what I remember is my father had to carry me because I would have sunk right down into the mud. And it rained for 3 or 4 months. The conditions there were really terrible. Then my parents had a chance to transfer to another camp called Gers. Rifsal, thank you. I have my correctors over here. So in Rifsal, they said it would be better. It wasn't really better. Instead of rain, there was no rain, but there in the summer, high temperatures and strong winds. As a matter of fact, my daughters and I just came from, I had never seen Riffsalt and I wanted to see it. So we just came from Riffsalt and saw the barracks. And the big surprise I'm deviating. The big surprise I had in Riffsalt was that they showed me the actual barrack that my father was in. You know, it's empty now, but I was able to see it, and it was very emotional for me to see that. So we remained in Riffsalt with the similar conditions for a year, but things kept getting worse and worse and worse. And after a year, my parents, the organizations that were in the camp, there were different Swiss Red Cross, the Unitarian, they said, our suggestion to my parents was, give your daughter up, put her in hiding, because things were getting so much worse in the camp. People were getting sick. I was getting sick. In Riffsalt, my mother was a kindergarten. She took care of the kindergarten kids, which made me so happy because I was that age and I could stay with her. I had never been away from my mother ever before. And one day they pulled me out of the kindergarten barracks and they said to me, sorry, my voice is going. Yeah, I'm gonna drink it. They said to me, you're gonna be going with this woman. And I said, why? And they said, because you're gonna be safer there. And I said, well, I don't wanna go. I had never been away from my mother before. I said, I don't wanna go. And they said, I'm sorry, you don't have any choice. You have to go with her and you have to listen to everything that she tells you to do. And I was, as you can imagine, I was not a very happy little girl. At that time, I was five or five and a half years old. And I went with a woman, and she brought me to a chateau. Her name was, the woman's name was Elsa Ruth. And I later found out she was the director of this chateau. It was run by the Swiss Red Cross for sick children, but not Jewish children. They were children who had lost their parents in the war. And there were only a few Jewish children who they were hiding there. I was one of them. And they said to me, well, your name Ronia sounds too German. You have to, it's now going to be Ronja. Same spelling, different French pronunciation. And the other thing that I remember the woman telling me is never, ever, ever tell anybody that you are Jewish. So those are the things I remember, and then I remember things that a little child would remember. I remember one night we were all in bed, and one of the children said, so, what religion are you? And when not to me, but to other children, and I thought, what am I going to say? I don't even remember what they told me to say. If they did tell me anything, I don't remember what it was. And I heard another child say, I'm Christian. And so when they got to me, I said, I'm Christian too. And so nothing happened. But the reason I remember it is because I was so scared. And, you know, it's something that it would stay in the mind of a little child. The other thing I remember is also silly, but I was, at night, I'm sure they were making Spaß. They were fooling around with me, and they were saying, never get up at night, because next to the bathroom there's a witch, and she will grab you if you go to the bathroom. Well, That scared a 5.5-year-old little girl so much that the whole year that I was in that chateau, I never got up at night. Even if I had to wet my bed, I never got up at night. But I never told the Schwesters who were running the place why. And they were not very happy when they had to change my bed sometimes in the morning. So when I first got to the camp, I was not very cooperative. I was mad at my parents. I didn't want to play with the other children. I felt that my parents had abandoned me. They weren't coming back. I didn't know why they weren't coming back. So after a few months, things got a little bit better because everybody in the chateau spoke French. I only spoke German. So after a few months, I was able to speak at least to some of the children because I had learned a little French, and I felt a little bit more comfortable, and I made a few friends. And then after 6 months, all of a sudden, Elsa Ruth, the director, called me to her room, and she said, "I have good news for you. We just heard, we got news, your parents escaped. They escaped to Switzerland, and we're going to try to get you together with them." So for the next 6 months, I did write. I couldn't write yet, but I sent them pictures to my parents until they figured out a plan to get me over the border in Switzerland. Finally, after 6 months, they came up with a plan. So this was the plan. They put me on the back of a bicycle, and one of the Schwesters, that's what we call them, maybe nurses, took me down. The chateau was on a steep hill. They took me down, someplace near the border of Switzerland and France. And they brought me to a house, and I think the house was run by the French resistance, people who were against Hitler who tried to help. And they said, "You're going to stay here for a few days." There was an older girl, maybe around your age there. And this was the plan. The plan was that they were going to get me across the border by me playing ball. I was supposed to play ball with this teenage girl. We practiced before. We were throwing the ball back and forth and back and forth. And then they told me, "She's going to give you a signal. When she gives you the signal, don't worry about catching that ball. Don't worry about anything. You just run out. She's going to throw it way over your head. Run as fast as you can. And don't catch the ball. Don't look back. Just run." And those were my instructions, and that's what I did. So all of a sudden, as I'm running, somebody grabbed me, and I thought, who is this? And he said, "Don't worry, I have you, you're safe, you're in Switzerland, I'm going to bring you to your parents." And I, with great relief, went with him. So he brought me to my parents, and you would think that I would run into their arms and be so happy. But I think I was still mad at them, that they had, I was young, I didn't understand they were doing it for my safety. And I wouldn't speak to them. And when I did speak to them, I only spoke to them in French. But after a while, I did start speaking German. And unfortunately, when you came into Switzerland, you had to be examined by a doctor. And because you didn't want to bring any diseases into Switzerland. So a doctor examined me, and unfortunately, they gave me an X-ray, and they found I had a black spot on my lung, and it was tuberculosis, which was very, very contagious. You know the word contagious? You could catch it very easily. So after being with my parents for only 2 days, they said, you have to be brought to a sanatorium for children who have tuberculosis. And that's where I went. So again, I was separated from my parents. And I was in that sanatorium for 1 year. My father visited me maybe 2 or 3 times. I'm sorry we don't have the pictures to show you, because in the picture, he took me to a professional photographer so he could bring it back to my mother, and I was not smiling in those pictures. So I was there for 15 months, a little over a year. And then I thought I would be brought back to my parents, but they couldn't, because the Swiss believed that you needed to go to a Swiss family, not to a refugee hotel. Well, finally, through some really nice people from the refugee hotel, the director there, she wrote a note to them saying they have to consider my mental state as well as my physical, as well as my health. And please let me go back to my parents, which they did. And I went with them to they were in a place called Kurwalden, Switzerland, little mountain town in Switzerland. And stayed there for 6 months. And then the very nice director of the hotel saw. By that time, my mother, I was really surprised to see, had my brother, 2 brothers. I came back to 2 little baby brothers, which was a big surprise to me. And there was a reason for one. I know you can ask me a question, why did my mother give birth when she was still in a refugee camp? But I stayed with them in this little mountain school, and then the director said, you know, my mother is a social worker and she's already taking care of 4 children. She would be willing to take Ronia too. It's a big school, she'll learn, it's a good school, much better than this little mountain school. She'll get home-cooked meals, and things will be much better for her. So my parents, you know the word reluctantly, what is reluctantly?
Zögerlich.
Zögerlich. Agreed, and they said I could go there, and I visited them on holidays. So then I don't think I have time to go into my father's story of how they escaped.
So I think we should.
Maybe if we have time at the end.
You're coming in from the United States. Now what you tell us is still in Switzerland. So there was a time when you left Switzerland, and
okay, yeah.
I would suggest that we see the reactions of the questions of the students.
Okay, because my parents have a really interesting story of how they escaped that camp. But after a while, it took almost 8 years for our family to get a visa. It was so hard to get a visa. We had no identification papers, and we left for the United States on a ship called the SS Uruguay. a converted military ship. We came to the United States. It was a hard trip over. The waves were big. I was seasick with my mother the whole way, but we didn't care because now we were free and safe. In 1946.
And then in 1946 you were 8 years old.
No,
10.
1947, was it 1947? I was almost 10 years old, and very quickly we came in May, I was put back to second grade because I didn't speak a word of English, and luckily I was little, so I didn't stand out that much until I learned my English, and I constantly had to learn new languages. You know, from German to French, and French to English, and so it was hard, but we were free, and we never complained. And just as a last word, what all of this made me as a person very appreciative. I appreciated everything in my life. Like, I did not take anything for granted ever. I always appreciated anything that I had in my life. So that's my story. My parents' story you'll have to hear another time.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I think we can learn a lot about persecution during the Nazi time. We can also learn a whole lot about psychology and about families and speaking or being quiet and what happens in the next decades. But we'll not be able to get into very deep. I think if Henry agrees, I think it's easier for the students to go to the questions now, because they just listen to you, and so we'll keep an eye on the watch until it's Henry's turn. So who wants to ask Ronia Beecher? Or comment? Könnt ihr kommentieren, ihr könnt Bemerkungen machen oder auch Fragen stellen. Ist unter euch irgendjemand, der selber eine Fluchtgeschichte hat? Ist jemand unter euch, der oder die selber Flüchtling ist, die Heimat verlassen musste? Seid ihr in der Hinsicht glücklich, darf man das sagen, dass ihr das nicht erlebt habt? Okay, wo sind eure Fragen oder Bemerkungen? Wir können, meinst du kannst sie hören auf Deutsch, die Fragen?
Yeah, ich kann. I will answer in English. You can speak German. I know. My German is terrible.
Als Sie in den USA ankamen, war der Umgang als Jüdin stark anders im Gegensatz zu Deutschland, oder gab es auch eine gewisse Judenfeindlichkeit?
Want to translate for me?
In America, when you arrived, did you experience some anti-Semitism also, or
No.
was the
No.
handling, how you were treated, was it very different from Germany?
Well, I didn't go to school in Germany, so, you know, I didn't experience anti-Semitism. Oh. I didn't go to school in Germany. I was too young, so I didn't experience anti-Semitism in Germany, but no, never where I lived in the United States, never.
Also gerne Frage, ob Sie sich auch an die Routineerinnerung an diese Konzentrationslager glauben. Die Tagesroutine.
The daily routine.
Do you remember some of the daily routine in the camp, in Rizal or in Gürs?
I just remember my happiest days were in the children's barrack when I was with my parents, because they made things out of paper. They sang songs. They told stories. So I can only tell you from the viewpoint of a 5.5-year-old child. But they did have, my father talks about having a library. All of the people who had brought any books, they were gathered in one barrack, and then the people who had nothing to do, like what is there to do in this big, big camp where you can't even visit each other, they would be able to take out a book. My father talks about that because he ran that library.
Vielleicht muss man erklären, dass Ronias Vater eine besondere Rolle im Lager hatte, weil er jüdischer Kantor war er in gewisser Weise privilegiert und deshalb konnte er auch seine kleine Tochter häufiger sehen, als es sonst der Fall gewesen wäre. Also wie eine Zwischenposition. Das heißt nicht, dass er genug zu essen hatte, aber dass er sich bewegen konnte im Lager, während sonst der Stacheldraht da war und man musste immer einen Erlaubniszettel haben, um von einer Baracke in die andere oder in einem Îlot, hieß das in Gürs, gehen zu können. Die Mutter hat Kinder unterrichtet und dadurch konnte Ronia eine Zeit lang mehr mit ihren Eltern zusammenbleiben.
Ja, und mein Vater war ein Lehrer, war auch ein Lehrer, und he took the teenagers, you know, so he was able to go across the line, across the Stachelrad, and that was a privilege that he was given.
Ich habe eine Frage an euch. Wie erklärt ihr euch denn, dass plötzlich, so wie Ronia das sagt, plötzlich die Eltern an eine Flucht gedacht haben und sie bereit waren, sie als kleines Kind wegzugeben? Was ist passiert, dass das nicht gleich am Anfang passierte, sondern zu einem ganz bestimmten Zeitpunkt? Ja? Laut.
Es gibt ja Arbeitslager und Konzentrationslager, vielleicht ist auch, dass sie aber an Gemeinden durften und welches dann in dieser Konzentration
Schwierige Diskussion über Konzentrationslager. Es war kein Konzentrationslager im richtigen, echten Sinne. Maybe you, Ronia sagte, guck das mal im Internet nach. Guck dir bitte mal nach, die Geschichte in Frankreich im August 1942. August 1942 was exactly the time when Ronia's parents were very much alerted. Und vielleicht hat es auch damit zu tun, dass dein Vater sehr im Lager rumkam und auch mit Leuten gesprochen hat.
Yeah, it's another thing that you can look up. There was a conference in January 1942 called the Wannsee Conference. There they made the decision, what are they doing with all of these Jews in France and all over? What are they going to do with them? They got them out of Germany, now what are they going to do with them? So at that conference, they decided we're going to kill them all. We're killing them all. We're making transports out of these camps, bringing them to the killing camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And so the people who were not lucky enough to escape all were taken and put on these transports. My grandfather was killed, my uncles who were in Gurs, they were all killed, aunts were killed. 1,700 people from the camps were killed, were taken to these, and it was because of the Wannsee, you can look it up on the internet, Wannsee Conference, 1942. After that, you know, they were all sent to be murdered. So my story is a lucky story. I'm a really lucky person, and really I appreciate every day of my life.
Sollen wir das als Schlusswort? I would take it as a not end, but intermission. Maybe we turn to our guests and ask Carol and Francois and Karen and Diane. Do you have a question at this point to Ronia's speech, Ronia's report? Diane, you could talk about your grandmother if you like to. Yes, she was in the same camp, in the same. She was not lucky. She was among those.
Yeah, my grandmother was taken to wars in 1940, and then in 1942 taken to Auschwitz and perished there. So, yeah, it was not very lucky. My grandfather was evacuated to Gore, was taken to Gores, but died on the way. I'm not, from medical problems, possibly had a heart attack, who knows. But my father and his brother did manage to leave Germany in 1937 and became naturalized U.S. citizens. My father ultimately in the U.S. Army, and came back to Germany with the U.S. Army and stayed with translation and whatnot after the war. So.
But Diane, how old were you when you learned about the death of your grandparents?
My father was one of these people, which is very typical with families of ours, that they don't talk about it. Just like Ronia's family, it was not talked about. But he did. We came to Breisach in 1967. I was 15 years old. And before we came, he did have me read the Diary of Anne Frank. He still did not talk to me about anything, but that was his way of trying to introduce me to the subject. Honestly, he never really mentioned. When I heard about his parents, his mother being killed at Auschwitz, it was him in conversation with other adults. Mm-hmm. Somebody having asked him a question. So, I have learned more about my family history since I've connected with the Blue House than I ever had from my father, through no fault of his own. It was just emotionally too much for him. So, yeah.
Thank you, Diane, for helping. Carol, do you want to add something? Olivia,
I just wanted to say two things. One, you and I have spoken about that. My mother's family is from Offenburg, and she was also 5 years old, and at different times got sent from her parents and then taken back. And it is the being sent away from your parents almost makes more of an impression than any of the other things going on in your life. But I was going to ask you, I know my aunt, and again, we share that my father and my aunt were born in Lorach, talks about going to school in New York and also being put back to second grade, and being teased mostly for her German accent, being in the United States in the 1940s, the late 1940s, when we were at war. Having a German name or a German accent was very hard, and I'm wondering if you got teased at all for being German.
I don't really remember that. I do remember some of the children being really nice to me and saying, "This is a glass. It's glass." You know, I didn't know the names for anything. This is a flower. This is, you know, I remember anyone who was really nice to me when I was in public school. I was very shy. I didn't talk much. The next year I went to third grade. The next year I went to fourth grade, and then they wanted to skip me. They skipped me. I skipped fifth grade. I went to sixth grade, and then they wanted to skip me again to put me into eighth grade, and I said no. I made some friends. I want to stay with these friends. I don't want new friends. What I did always feel was a little bit different. How do you say different?
Anders sein.
Anders. Ich fühle sehr anders wie die andere Kinder, because of everything that I went through, I was very shy, and but I did have friends. I did have a few friends, but I didn't, you know.
Darf ich einen Kommentar machen aus meiner beruflichen Sicht? Ich bin Ärztin und Psychotherapeutin, und ich finde, wenn wir dir zuhören, dann kann man sehen, wie wenig die Erwachsenen von Kindern verstehen. Ja? So, Ronia wurde von den Eltern getrennt, traumatisch, dramatisch, und jetzt möchte man ihr aus scheinbar guten Gründen sie wieder aus der Klasse rausnehmen, in eine andere Klasse, in eine andere, ja? Und das ist komplett falsch. Aber du hast dich gewehrt, du hast gesagt nein, und das war sehr, sehr wichtig, weil
ich sagte genug.
Ja, genau, okay. Sind alle einverstanden, dass wir jetzt Henry zuhören? Und dann können wir schauen, ob am Schluss noch auch, weil es sehr unterschiedliche Geschichten sind, very different stories, können wir am Schluss schauen, ob es noch Fragen gibt, auch an Ronia. Danke erstmal. Do you agree? Henry, hast du mich verstanden? Du bist jetzt dran.
Yeah.
It's your turn. Okay?
Good. Thank you.
Good morning. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you all. My story is somewhat different. My father was born in Breisach, and my grandparents lived in Breisach. But I was born in Tingen, Waldshut im Schwarzwald. I will move on to English, if you don't mind, because my German is very weak. I was born in 1931, which was just before the beginning of the Nazi strength in politics in Germany. Because I was very young, I will tell you things that I have been told rather than I remember. In about 1932-33, my father went to Palestine because he understood what was happening in Germany, that Jews were not welcome. He went to Palestine, and in Palestine he found there was a lot of animosity between Arabs and Jews and the British government, which had the mandate from the League of Nations to govern Palestine. So he decided to come back. And he had a friend called Moritz Meyer who had gone to France. And so Moritz Meyer had family who had gone to Argentina. And so he wrote to them and said, I've moved to France. People are very welcoming here. I'm doing well. Come from Argentina and set up in France. Unfortunately, this was a wrong examination of events. Of course, when war broke out, France collapsed and Jews were rounded up, and all of the people that he brought from Argentina were killed. So before that happened, before the war, my father thought he would follow his friend Max Meyer, and we went to France. And I can remember being in a chateau in winter with icicles coming down from the ceiling. And my father, although he came from Breisach, which is very near to Alsace, didn't speak any French, and he didn't know what to do, so he used to spend his time chopping down trees to make firewood to keep us warm. And after a while, we got a stone jar full of duck fat and liver, with a note from my grandmother in Breisach saying, why are you sitting in France? Everything is fine in Germany. And this is an example of how people interpret what they hear incorrectly, or in some cases correctly. So we came back from France, and my father, who was a cattle dealer, carried on a very successful business as a cattle dealer, so much so that most people at that time didn't have motor cars, but he bought himself a Wanderer, which was a very big car which he used to drive around to all the farms where he would buy and sell cattle. So one day we got a knock on the front door, and the Gestapo were there, and they arrested my father and took him to court for buying all the goats in southwest Germany, which was nonsense. He never dealt in goats at all. He only dealt in cattle. So came to court, and the local big landowner was a customer of my father, and he was the local magistrate. So when the trial came, the magistrate said, this whole thing is rubbish, and threw it out. And he said to my father, come and see me in my office. So after the trial, my father went to see him, and he said, look, this time I was able to throw out this charge, but next time they'll make it stick, so I suggest you get out. So my father went home and thought about what he should do, and there is a railway which goes from Germany through Switzerland back to Germany in an area called Zollernschluss. So my father took that train, because if you wanted to leave the country, you had to pay all sorts of fines and were not allowed to take many of your possessions with you. So when the train stopped in Basel, there are two platforms, a German platform and a Swiss platform, because it's going back into Germany. So he got off on the German platform, found a way underneath through a tunnel, and came up on the Swiss side. And from there, he and a friend of his, Fritz Picard, went to Africa, because at that time it was very difficult for people to immigrate anywhere, because most countries were closing the door and said, we don't want any more Jewish refugees. So that left my mother and my sister, who's 7 years older than me, back in Tingen. And my mother sort of made things as comfortable as possible for her two children. And I can remember once on St. Nicholas Day, there was a knock on the door and there was a present for me. My sister knew what was going on, but for me this was just a wonderful thing. My sister went to school in Waldshut and took the train every day from Tingen to Waldshut, which is not a long journey. But after a while, because she was Jewish, the other students on the train used to take her books and throw them off the train, and she used to have to go back and collect her books and to go home. So after a while, she gave up using the train and used to cycle from Tingen to Waldshut. The education was very difficult at the time. I can remember my sister's school was having a swimming gala, but she was not allowed to take part. So my mother, my sister and I went up a hill overlooking the swimming pool where the school was having the competition. And so on, these difficulties came. I personally I would say never went to school. I can remember as a boy of 4 or 5 going to school one morning, and because of the treatment, at lunchtime I ran away and went home. After my dad went to Palestine, and I told you we then went to France. And when we came back from France, my father then went to devious ways with the money he had smuggled across the border. Of course, Tingen is just on the other side of the Rhine from a small town called Koblenz in Switzerland. And so he went to Africa, and my mother organized things, or started to organize things, and my grandfather in Breisach was arrested and sent to Dachau. And at the same time, my two uncles who lived in Waldshut, Adolf and Philipp Bloch, were also arrested and sent into Dachau. After a time, my understanding of the situation is they threw people out of Dachau because the Nazis felt that their main opposition at that time was the communist development, which was growing in Germany. So they arrested a lot of left-wing people, which post-war, some of the leaders of Germany would talk about having spent time in Dachau. After a while, my mother, with the help of my uncle Adolf, who had been thrown out of Dachau, bought all the sort of things, because my father had gone to South Africa to settle, but the government in South Africa, which was led by two people, Smuts and Herzog, said, we don't want any more refugees. So he went on the train to the next stop, to a place called Southern Rhodesia, which today is Zimbabwe. And he eventually got a business called a hot dog stall. And he wrote to...
May we ask the students know what hot dogs are? Are you familiar with hot dogs? Habt ihr welche gegessen oder an der Leine mit euch geführt? Wisst ihr, was Hot Dogs sind? Ja? Okay. I wondered if they know what hot dogs are.
Well, yes. Well, my father, in fact, wrote back to his mother, I have a hot dog stall. So she didn't know any English. She went to some local man and asked for a translation. And they said, your son has got a business selling dogs on heat. So this was a bit of a surprise for my grandmother. And my father, who ran this place, which was a hot dog was really a Vienna sausage in a sandwich. And he ran this, and because he was German and spoke hardly any English in running this, he was called Fritz by the customers and not Alfred, which was his name. So after a while, my mother got ready with the help of my uncle Adolf to emigrate to Southern Rhodesia. And I can remember looking at the brochures from travel agents who were arranging our trip. And the travel agents' brochures were very glossy, as I'm sure any travel brochures you've seen today are very glossy. And it showed pictures of a train going through a jungle with monkeys hanging from the trees. So eventually, with the help of my uncle, we went to Hamburg, where we took a boat to go to Cape Town in South Africa. And the trip on the boat was fairly uneventful, although I was a naughty little boy and was running in parts of the ship which was not for passengers but only for staff. Anyway, we arrived in Cape Town, and there were a number of Jewish families in Cape Town who helped us get on a train to Southern Rhodesia. And I used to hang out of the window waiting to see the jungle with the monkeys hanging out. But in fact, the train goes through an area called the Karoo, which is a desert. So there was no excitement there. Anyway,
Fantastic. I think probably the time is tight, and we should let the students ask some questions. But
yes, sure.
Well done.
Anyway, my father was Fritz, and when we arrived in Bulawayo in 1938, in February, I think it was, which was just about a year before the war broke out. So I went to a school in Bulawayo, which was run by German nuns. It was a convent school, which was the same school as my sister was at. So, but they all spoke English, so there was nothing strange there. And eventually, after about 6 months, we moved house, and I went to a normal grammar school in Bulawayo. Now, if you have any queries, I'd love to answer them.
were you still afraid after you were moving or you escaped?
Say it again, it's slower.
Were you still afraid after your moving or your escape to Africa?
If he was afraid.
Yes, or scared.
Hattest du Angst auch nach der Flucht?
Actually, never.
Never.
I personally never came across any animosity, and my father, who, although he was called Fritz because of his German accent and hardly spoke any English, really got on quite well with his clients. In fact, the one story in the family was somebody made some joke to him, and he said, "Why are you doing that?" And they said, "Oh, we're only pulling your leg." And they said, "Well, why do you want to pull my leg?"
That's an English expression. If you
An
pull
English expression, yes.
If you pull somebody's leg, you're just joking.
You're making a joke about
You're making a joke.
But he didn't understand that. And so, I grew up in southern Rhodesia, and after...
There was a German community there. There was a bit of a German community.
There was a Jewish community in southern Rhodesia at the time. There was a Jewish community which had been there for a long time. They mainly had left Europe in the Russian and Polish pogroms in the 1900-1910 period. And then later on, and they formed, by the time we got there in 1940 really, they were established, and they were the dominant Jewish community in the time. And then there was an influx of German Jews of the type of my father, really people who were trying to establish themselves, and they formed another community. And after that came a third community, which were people who were the doctors and professionals in Germany who thought to themselves, you know, Hitler's just a scare politician and everything will go away. And when they discovered that actually they were going to be rounded up, they left Germany, and they formed a hierarchy of better educated Jews from Europe who established themselves in Rhodesia. Now, even Rhodesia closed its gates after a while. That was southern Rhodesia, and people had to move on to northern Rhodesia, which today is Zambia.
Maybe you already got a lot of answers to questions that you prepared, but maybe I want to encourage you even to ask the second generation, maybe the daughters of Ronia and the daughter of Henry, because they experienced something different or what they heard. Maybe you have questions also for them, just spontaneously. So I like to encourage you. Ja, okay, I understand them. Aber ihr habt mich verstanden, oder? Also ihr habt sicherlich schon viele Antworten bekommen auf die Fragen, die ihr formuliert habt, kann ich mir vorstellen, von den Lebensgeschichten. Aber wir haben jetzt auch nochmal Ronias beide Töchter sind ja auch da und auch die Tochter von Henry. Vielleicht habt ihr auch Fragen an die beiden, an die drei.
Okay, also es ist jetzt eine Frage an alle eigentlich, und zwar wie das alles, der Krieg und so, das Leben nach dem Krieg, also beeinflusst hat, ob das immer noch heutzutage einen Einfluss auf die Leben hat, sowohl als auch für die Kinder als auch für die beiden selber.
experiences you had during the war have an impact after the war and for your daily life today, for each of you? One stand.
I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it's interesting how experience of being a refugee echoes down the generations, and the memory of an ancestry that is lost is always there in the sort of cultural psyche of the family. So I'm not German, I understand a very small number of words, but it's very interesting to me that when my father comes back to Germany, it's like coming home. And that sense of German food, German culture, German architecture, history is very present and runs through the generations. And I think the other thing that stays is if people have been a refugee, they always have this refugee mentality, and that goes also down the generations a bit. You never feel quite so much that your home is always your home. There is always maybe the need to run somewhere else, the need to have a back door for escape, or that maybe you have to make a new life in a different part of the world. And of course, this is important for many refugees. It's not just Jewish refugees. So, interesting question. Thank you.
So I have a question for you, Henry. So, how was it to, or how is it to be here after such a long time? You were in a country. How do you feel about being back in Germany after such a long time?
It's very much a two-sided answer. Sometimes one feels at home from memories of when one was a little person. And sometimes you remember what happened during the war and the Holocaust. And so you feel a certain level of animosity which is generalized but is not personalized.
War das verständlich?
Did you understand?
I have also a question for you, Henry. How was it for you when you realized you had to move to another country?
How did you feel about when you realized you had to move to a different country?
I'm afraid I can't really answer that, because I was a little boy. I left Germany aged 5 or 6, and it was just a journey for me at the time. Nowadays, I sit in England, and every day in the newspaper we hear about people coming from France in small boats, and a lot of them drown because the water gets rough. And I know just before I left England, the number for the 2023 was 40,000 people had come from France to England. And this is not the only place. It is happening also in Italy and in Greece, where people are trying to get away from poverty in some cases and from persecution in other cases. It's a worldwide problem.
Darf ich was fragen? Also zum einen, vielleicht soll man noch erklären, dass Henry mit seiner Schwerhörigkeit umgeht in seinem Alter und deshalb hat er dieses Gerät. Aber Henry und auch unser anderer Gast, der hinten filmt, Seth Alberts, wir haben beide ein Kleidungsstück, das wir nicht haben oder nicht so kennen. Und jetzt wollte ich mal das Augenmerk dahin richten. So I said, both of you, Seth and Henry, you have decided to wear a kippah today. So what was your thought about it? I don't know if the students know kippah or kippot.
Well, a kippah is a thing like this. This particular one I got in Cape Town about 3 weeks ago, where I went to a bar mitzvah, if you've ever heard of that, which is when Jewish boys turn 13, they go through a ceremony of reading from the Torah. And many Jews wear a kippah all the time. Personally, I only wear it occasionally, usually when I go to synagogue. But there are some people, some of my nephews, who wear a kippah all the time, and I thought I would wear it today rather symbolically, rather than what I do every day.
Okay. Seth, do you want to comment on that? Seth is the husband, is der Ehemann von Carol Bodenheimer.
So I'm going to add a little bit. The reason to wear a kippah, and I personally do keep my head covered in places where I feel safe to wear a kippah, I do. There are places even now in America, close to the city where I live, where I don't feel safe being identified as a Jew. And in those places, I either wear a baseball cap or another hat. But you keep your head covered out of respect for God. So the kippah is a holy head covering, so to speak.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. Just to talk a little bit about, one young lady here had asked what life was like after you, to both of you, you got to the United States and how it felt. And can you just tell them a little bit about how your family's life changed, your living conditions coming from being comfortable in Germany, like everybody else, just living among the community, and then you went to the camps and you had those terrible years of separation and your parents' escape and all of that, and you came to the United States and felt safe, but how you had to live for the next number of years. You talked about school, but can you just talk about how your family had to live?
So yes, we came to the United States. My father had been a teacher and a cantor. He didn't speak English. What is he going to do? He had 3 children. And he changed his profession to a cabinet maker, Möbel, wie sagt man, a Schreiner, Möbelschreiner, because he had to, and he liked, in Switzerland, he liked working with wood. He had carved things. So we moved, our family got us an apartment above a embroidery store, which was good because, and where they embroidered bunnies, Hasen, and
Spielzeug, yeah?
Yeah.
Toys.
No. It was sweaters for babies where you embroidered, which was good for my mother because after she was finished taking care of the children, she would go downstairs, get a whole pile of sweaters to earn extra money. She would embroider these things. My father became a cabinet maker, made all of our furniture. Where we lived was a cold water flat. They had no hot water, they had no shower, they had no bathtub. The bathroom was out in the hall. So here is my mother. She has 3 children, 2 of them still in diapers, and had to deal with all of that. So life was really hard. I went, besides going to school after I turned 16, I worked in a hospital setting up trays just to earn a little extra money. I worked as a salesperson in a department store my last year. Life was really, really hard, but we never complained. We were so happy that we were free and nobody was bothering us. And someone asked, how did all of this affect your life? When I read my father's story, you haven't heard my father's story, there were some people who, out of kindness, spontaneously helped them instead of turning them in and bringing them to prison, bringing them to camp. They helped. And that was the only reason that they were rescued and that they made it into Switzerland. And as a teenager, when I heard my parents' story, because the times were so dark, and I could never believe how something like this could have happened in a country that was educated, where people, like, how does something like this happen in a country? I couldn't understand. And it was important for me to focus on the people who helped, who were kind. And that's really what I'd like to impart on all of you young people, that in life, when you do something kind for somebody else, you never know, you might not know in English, it's called the ripple effect. When you throw a stone, the rings from that stone go very wide. And sometimes when you are kind to someone who's having a difficult time, you don't know how that kindness affects that person's life. And that's really what I would like to leave you with, that even in the playground, or someone who feels left out, or someone who doesn't speak the same language, this is what I remember. I have never forgotten anyone in my life who did something kind for me. And that's what I'd like you to remember, that to be part of the light and the love in this world, and not the hate.
I was just going to add to that this session has been a session of hope for the future, and that you should take that with you.
Ich glaube, dass wir, now I speak English so Karen can also follow, and you, we have heard about great differences in your experiences, and we have heard about a similarity. What I mean is that I hear from Ronia that until her parents could, they were very protective of her. The first years, you didn't hear Nazis scream. They had you as a toddler, like this, walking. And I think I can hear it from you too, that your mother, you said yesterday, your mother was wonderful in trying to protect her children. You were the younger one. Your older sister was exposed in school much more than you, and so that creates a certain security. Now, with coming the August 1942 in the camp situation, they could not continue to be protective of you, but nobody explained that to you, and I see that it bothers you until today. So the questions remain, you know. So that I wanted to share with the younger generation, that we learn a lot about psychology, you know. You were not in a Hitlerjugend organized because you were too small. I mean, different levels of experiences according to the age you had.
You know, you mentioned the Hitlerjugend, and it was in the Hitlerjugend that the young people had to join, and that's where they were, in English they say brainwashed, with everything bad that you could possibly think of that a Jewish person would do. And, you know, when I was a little kid, I would say, I never did anything bad to anybody. Like, why is it bad to be Jewish? And, you know, that's what I couldn't understand. But the German children were taught in the Hitler Youth from early on. They had games, you know, kill the Jew, you know, all books, and they grew up with all of this hatred. So it was planned out, and you have to be careful who comes into power, you know.
I would just like to remind a piece of history, and that is, on Kristallnacht, almost the whole country rose up against the Jews. There were synagogues destroyed all over the country, and shops were looted and all the rest of it. And then they went on through a war until where we are today, which is a very different Germany, I hope.
So I would like to ask Rosita to come up and give us your history, what you created in Freiburg. I know that you were personally traveling to meet Ronia in her home in America and to research her story. So I don't think that the students know you and know your part in the history.
Okay, thank you. Actually, my name is Rosita Dienst-Demuth, and I was a history teacher at the Lessing Realschule in Freiburg. And actually through a story also dealing with cattle dealers in Oberrotweil, a 10-kilometer away little village, I came to Christiane and Günther Boll and asked, who is Max Mock, the cattle dealer? Yes, because we interviewed old people, and they said, yeah, and suddenly he was away, and the people did not pay him money anymore, and they beat him up after 33. That was very quick, that he was very badly treated. Yeah.
It was a very difficult time. And if you read the situation properly, you got out. And if you thought, well, it's all past, you probably died.
So I made a a students' workshop in Oberrotweil to interview these old people and went to the Blue House. And so I got to know Christiane, and there was a lady from Emmendingen originally. She came from all the way from Jerusalem and said, "Here I am, Else Pripis," and she was interviewed by you, and she told us, I was not allowed to go to school in Emmendingen anymore. I had to go to school, to the lesson school, where 2 classrooms were only for Jewish children from the bigger, wider area. From Mülheim, from Sulzburg, from Offenburg, from Villingen, from Breisach, Ihringen and Eichstätten, from Kippenheim and Schmieheim, all these little Jewish community villages. And I was shocked because I didn't know that in my school building there was a mandatory school for Jewish children from 1936 on. So I started a history workshop. And I started to ask, also, always with the help of the Blue House as well, of Christiane, I asked about the names of the Jewish children, the names of the teachers who taught them in 2 classrooms only. And they were quite divided from the other students. And it took us 3 years that we found 60 Jewish names of students and 5 teachers. And I had contact into 6 countries to 25 survivors. So we invited them back to talk about it and to remember this special, very special history of our school. We have tablets and films and website and Instagram, and so now this school is not forgotten anymore, but it took more than 60 years till we remembered again. So today
6 million died.
That is okay, we talked about, we wanted to know what happened with these students and teachers. Yes? And actually, from these 60 students, only 4 died. But they died they survived. They had to go on with their life without their parents often. Because the parents were deported in 42 from Gurs to Auschwitz. So they had a very hard life.
Rosita, tell how we met.
Yes. I told you that we found 60 names and made contact to 25 survivors. And suddenly, in 2017, our project was found by Andrea, get up, because she found us in the internet and said, "Hello, I saw my father on your picture in the internet. My father is the teacher of the mandatory school for Jewish children. His name is..."
Her grandfather.
Yes, your grandfather.
My father.
Okay.
Was on the internet.
And my mom, Ronia, was the daughter of this last teacher of the mandatory school for Jewish children and was deported, and we would like to visit you, to come back. And that was a great thing. Our initiative to find the students and the teachers was so successful that we were found as well. And it was not so easy for Ronia because she did not, the first visit was in 2017. She did not remember so much, was not confident enough to speak German again. So I brought together only 15 nice, I knew very nice, dependable students, and we tried a little German-English conversation. But then I thought this history is so interesting and so important for us also to learn from it, that I decided to visit her in the United States and to look at all the documents and to bring all the history, the story together. And so she came back in 2018, and what did she do? She gave presentations in German language before, in front of 50 students, even 100 students in another school. So that was a great achievement for us that you came back to Freiburg. Thank you.
I wrote my speech in English, and I said to Rosita, you have to translate it for me, and because I can't speak German, I'm not flüssig genug, I'm not fluent enough. I can understand, but I am. So would you translate? So she actually came to my house in New York and translated it. Now I can write my speech in English, and I can put it through translate on the computer. You can translate from one language to another. So Christiana did not have to come to my house to translate it. The computer did it. But I had somebody read it to make sure that, but not here. I only spoke English, and how many of you could understand me? I hope you could understand what I was saying. Okay, some. Okay.
Okay. And we are very much looking forward to meet you this afternoon at 4 o'clock to visit the Stumbling Stones. You all know Starbucks in the Kaiser Josef Straße. Yes, there are Stumbling Stones. When you visit later or another time, Stolpersteine, look at them and read them. They are very interesting, the Stumbling Stones about this family. And tomorrow we will welcome you in our lesson school. And 50 more students are happy and lucky to get in touch with you, to hear your story, and to have their conversation with you. Thank you.
Als wir vorbereitet haben, haben wir mit den Gästen, die hier heute und morgen mit Schülern und Schülerinnen sprechen, haben wir gesagt, welche Fragen habt ihr an die Schüler und Schülerinnen? Und da kamen einige. So I'm wondering if you are keeping questions that you want to bring up, or Carol, or Karen, or Diane, or François. You have a question?
My question is from any of you. Have any of you come from another country, not speaking the language and having to integrate here in Germany? Anybody from the people here? And I was just wondering how you felt, how it made you feel to have to leave your country and come to a country where you don't speak the language.
I can just go from my own experience. and it depends on age. I came to Rhodesia age 6 or 7, and within 6 months I was fluent in English.
Yeah, and I came at 10, and it took me almost a year to lose my German accent and to be able to speak. And I didn't have a big vocabulary, but I was able to speak.
I have a question to Karen. Does your father have a slight German accent, a South African, a Rhodesian, or a British, or a mixture?
For me, he's just my father. But I think he has a slight Southern African Rhodesian accent. But maybe you can hear it better than I can. Yeah. But I don't think he really has a German accent anymore. But I'm interested if he speaks a little German. Does he sound to you authentic? Does it sound like Schweizerdeutsch, or does it sound like a good accent when you hear him speak? But
it sounds ziemlich Hochdeutsch, ziemlich more High German than. And I don't know if I may correct you. What I learned about your biography is that you were not born in Waldshut, but in Freiburg, as your sister.
No, my sister was born in Freiburg. I was born in Waldshut.
In the hospital?
Hmm?
In the hospital?
I presume so, yes.
Ah, okay. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Because it was being born in Freiburg, living in Waldshut-Tiengen meant that you had rather modern parents. Yeah? So to go to a hospital, to go to a safer place for delivery was more modern. I can see it in the birth records of the Jewish community when they started to have their children in Freiburg and not in Breisach.
Well, she was born in 1924, which was before the animosity started.
I was just going to make a comment about the accent. My parents both went to America very young, 5 and 10, and they had no accent. But their voices changed almost completely when they spoke in German. The first time I heard my mother speaking in German for an extended period, I realized, or as a young adult, the first time I heard her speaking, I realized her voice sounded completely different when she spoke in German. And I think she sounded younger. I can't say that for sure. I don't know if you guys think that your mother's voice changes when she speaks German or English, but my parents did.
I think also, since she was so young, she just wanted to fit in. She completely lost her German accent. She didn't grow up speaking German, and in fact, she joined probably 15, 20 years ago a German club where she would speak, she would practice speaking German, but as Rosita said, until she came back here, and started coming back, and I think it's very good for her brain also to process this. She started really practicing her German, and we were surprised at how well she was able to speak because she never spoke German. I started studying German on my own, and my father said, why would you speak and why do you want to learn German? This is a little while ago. And I would practice with my mother, and she sounded like a 5-year-old speaking. When we started, we spoke like 5-year-olds speaking German to each other. And that's why I'm so impressed by her accent now, by her fluency now. It really, after these years, since 2017, it started, so much started coming back to her. And I don't know if you noticed, I was trying to get her to change while she was talking, but she wasn't looking at me, but she kept talking about they. When she's talking about her story, she was talking about what happened at the beginning to them. And them was really her. And when we came back the first time in 2017, she said to us, you know, I'm really starting to feel sorry for this little girl. And we said, Mom, this little girl was you. She separated herself so much from her story. And same with German. She didn't speak German. She separated from her story, and it wasn't something that happened to her and her family, maybe her family, but not to her. And as we've been coming back to Germany, and she's been talking about her story more, and she's been speaking in German more, and coming back here, you get the same. We were surprised by all the accents here, the Badische accents that we're so familiar with, and the foods, and and it's been coming back to her, and now it's starting to be a story about her. And she still struggles with it, because at the beginning.
Now it's our story. It's my story with my parents. Before that, I held it someplace separate. And my father spoke with a very, very, very heavy German accent.
Mine also.
Yeah.
Looking at the watch, and I think it's time that we say very much thank you for your stories that you shared with us and the students here. And if there's maybe one more question, then I would like to close this and say thank you very, very much. So I give to Christiane, and just one organizational thing I would ask you then, before you leave, just to put the chairs together, just pile them together. But now, hand it over.
I'm thinking of two more similarities with all the differences that there are in your experiences. The first is that die Breisacher sprechen oft über die echten Breisacher. Und man macht Quatsch und sagt, ja, wie viele Generationen müssen hier schon gelebt haben, bis du ein echter Breisacher bist. Ich weiß nicht, ob das noch heute so ist. Aber die wirklich echten Breisacher, die sind jetzt zu Besuch gekommen. Families that lived here, Familien, die hier 300 Jahre gelebt haben. Der Geburtsname von Ronias Mutter war Geismar, und Familie Geismar hat 300 Jahre in Breisach gelebt. Und die Familie von Henry ist die Familie Blum, die auch ein bisschen weniger, aber auch 250 Jahre hier gelebt hat. Und dann möchte ich noch eine andere Ähnlichkeit betonen. Und natürlich sind wir sehr dankbar, dass ihr in diese uralte Heimat eurer Familie kommt, zu uns. Ich möchte noch eine Ähnlichkeit betonen, nämlich, dass es über Henrys Vater Alfred Fritz wurde ein Vorbild für ein Theaterstück, was auch verfilmt worden ist. Und das heißt, Thomas Strittmatter ist der Autor und heißt Fiyut Levi. Und man kann es wahrscheinlich auch auf YouTube finden. Also sein Vater war das Vorbild für diesen Schriftsteller, diese Geschichte zu erfinden, aber auch sehr nah an der Wahrheit zu bleiben. Und die Similarity ist, dass über Ronia ein Film gerade im Entstehen ist, den die Familie zusammen macht, aber vor allem Tochter Judy damit befasst ist. Also in absehbarer Zeit werden wir einen Film mit dem Titel, und du hast es betont, Lauf Ronia, Lauf Ronia, Lauf ist der Titel und bezeichnet diese eine Situation, die das Kind Ronia in Sicherheit brachte, in die Schweiz. So können wir da gespannt sein, und hier können wir schon nacharbeiten, wenn wir wollen, über den Film. When did you see the film last?
The film I only saw when I came here, and I was in Freiburg, and I saw an advertisement. Der Fiyut Levi. I thought I must see that. That was my father. But there are two versions. One typifies my father like an Eastern European Jew, and the other one more of a German Jew. And they're quite different. In the one film, he has what are called payot, which is long locks of hair on each side, and they spoke Yiddish, whereas German Jews actually didn't speak Yiddish, although Yiddish has a lot of German words. So, but I also have the book. I think by Strittmayer.
Strittmatter, ja.
Yeah.
You gave it to the library, so ihr dürft es gerne ausleihen. Wer sich da weiter interessiert, könnt ihr das bei uns abholen. Vielen Dank für das Buch. Und wir sind neugierig auf den.
I think when you ask about accent, in my normal life in London, when I speak to someone on the phone, they say, "Where do you come from in South Africa?" I say, "No, from Rhodesia." But my parents, I think you could typify what they said as girlish, German English.
Ja, vielen Dank allen, Frau Gönner, allen, die geholfen haben vorzubereiten, vor allem auch Valeska. Danke François, Carol, Karen, Judy, Andrea und Diane für eure Teilnahme. Und ich danke auch der Kollegin von der Badischen Zeitung, die fleißig mitgehört und mitgeschrieben hat. Ja?
Ich will nur am Ende noch kurz was fragen.
Ja, bitte. Ja, bitte.
Auf Englisch.
I hope I speak loud and clear enough. In my not as good English, I would like to speak for the whole class and for my two teachers here. We would like to thank you both and for the rest of the family here for the beautiful two speeches and for the rest of the information given to us here today. As Ronia said, she appreciates everything. We do appreciate your speeches as well, and this was an opportunity given to us once in a lifetime maybe, and yeah, thank you. And we'd like to give some sort of feedback or something in a couple of days maybe. Yeah.
We would love that.
Yeah. So thank you last time.
And thank you all for listening.
Thank you all for coming here. It's been very good for you to hear the stories that we tell you, and we hope you take it further through your connections in other classes and in other families. Thank you very much. And thank you for Christiana for organizing all this. She's put in a lot of work.
Hoffentlich sehen wir uns mal wieder bei einer Gelegenheit. Alles Gute für euch.